Before we get into today's episode, let me ask you something. Do you know what your current level of English really is? Understanding your level is crucial to tracking your progress and ensuring your hard work is paying off. That's why I've created a quick and easy English level test that you can take right now for free. Find out your level instantly. Just head to thebritishenglishpodcast.com/testme or check the link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the British English Podcast. For today's episode, we got the spectacles out and did some reading around the topic of the English country house. And when I say we, I mean me and Ben Marks. Let's go with the historian that lives down under. Ben has been on the podcast before. We talked about the Great Fire of London and we also did a Harry Potter-based episode. But for today's one, Ben actually suggested that we dive into the world of the exclusive, the insanely wealthy and most likely incredibly posh-sounding people who had the keys to the great English country houses. This is going to be a history-heavy episode, but as always, we will try to keep it conversational. I'll let Ben lead this as he has a plethora of knowledge in his noggin about this. I've done about a day's research, if that, on this, so I will try to keep up. But to steal one of Ben's facts, even before we say hello to him, I wanted to set the scene with some stats to help you better understand the significance of these homes and why we are talking about them today. These homes required a huge amount of servants or people who worked in and around the grounds of these huge homes. And as an industry, domestic service, or being in service as it was called, was the largest single employer in Britain in its peak, which I imagine still affect our culture today, such as the language we use, the dialects we have, and the class-based system that still lingers. And a pretty mad stat to set the scene as well is that I heard a historian mention that there are about 10,000 English country houses currently. I double-checked that, though, and found it to be like 3,000 today, but upwards of 5,000 back when they were more popular, which Ben can perhaps start us on with a rough timestamp of when these houses were built. But according to this rather excitable American historian that I was listening to, an English country house was always the centre of a cultural estate, which had about 3,000 to 5,000 acres of land, which, again, I thought was ridiculous. So I checked that. And it was more like 500 to 1,500 acres of land, depending on who you believe. Maybe we should take what I say with a pinch of salt and listen to the real historian across the table from me. So, let's do that right now. The guy from Down Under, known as Ben Marks. How are you doing as well today, sir?
Not too bad, Charlie. Thanks for that intro. That was very kind. I wouldn't classify myself as a full-on historian, but I like to think that I know a bit. I thought we would talk about this as a topic today. We talked about the Great Fire of London last time, but I thought we would talk about this today because it's a very iconic part of Britain, the great English country house.
Hello, sir. Welcome to the British English Podcast Bed and Breakfast. How can I help you?
Oh, yes, I'd like to check in early, please. I have a reservation under the name of Mr. Smith, and I'd like to listen to the podcast for free.
Certainly. And would you like a turn-down service and a complimentary worksheet with your stay?
Pardon me?
A turn-down service and a free worksheet.
What on earth are they?
Let's see now, shall we? A turn-down service includes getting your bedroom ready for a night of sleep. In other words, I get in your bed, roll around in it, and then get back out. Oh, and the free worksheet is available for anyone listening to the British English Podcast. You can access it by going to the britishenglishpodcast.com/freebies. That's FREEBIES. By clicking the link in the show notes of this episode, or you can download the app called the British English Podcast app. It's rather impressive, as you can listen to every single episode and see the free worksheet on the same page. Very, very useful, and as I said, complimentary usage for any of our guests. So, how's about that turn-down service, eh? Fancy it? I think I'll pass on that, thanks, but I'll definitely be downloading the app you mentioned, yeah. Where can I get my hands on that, then? In your device's app store, sir. Search BEP for BEP or the British English Podcast. You can't miss it. Right. Yeah. Brilliant. Oh, what room number am I? Room number 325, sir. Take the lift up to the 3rd floor, take a left, and voila! Your home away from home awaits you. Right. Thank you. See you tomorrow at breakfast. Sleep well. Don't let the bed bugs bite, because we really do have an abundance of them on the 3rd floor.
It's one of the main things we think about when we think about Britain. When we think of the upper classes of Britain, these sprawling estates are what we see in TV shows and movies. We can most recently think of the famous series Downton Abbey.
Yes. And Bridgerton as well, I suppose.
Bridgerton. I actually haven't seen Bridgerton.
Okay. It's basically Downton Abbey, but just more sex.
Okay. Right. Well, yes, Downton Abbey was distinctly lacking in that, as actually those houses were at the time. There was a huge effort to segregate these houses in almost every possible way. The servants were segregated from the family who lived upstairs.
Right.
We'll get more into that later. But the servants themselves were segregated by their rank and by their gender. The men always slept in men's quarters and the women always slept in women's quarters. And any sort of sexual relations between unmarried people was strictly forbidden in almost every single major household.
And is this, we're talking about the servants or workers of the house, or are we talking also about the actual family members? Well, I suppose they were siblings, right?
Yes.
Don't touch your sister.
I would say if you're sneaking into another, if you're a male in the family upstairs and you sneak into a female's room, it's either your mother or your sister. So,
or your grandmother.
Or your grandmother. Yeah, actually, I think the grandmother, if she was of any sort of rank, lived in her own separate property. But I'm sure you could sneak out of the house in the middle of the night across there if that was your jam.
Yeah. So, okay. So the workers weren't able to mingle at night. But yeah, let's go back a little bit. So
yeah, sorry, to go back, basically, I decided to talk about this with you today because, as I said, it's an iconic part of Britain, but it's also, more importantly, it's a very important part of British history and society to understand. It comes from basically the building blocks of European society.
Wow.
And Britain is probably the only country in Europe today, if you consider England part of Europe, Britain part of Europe, that still largely practices these ideas of the land-owning gentry.
Okay, so no other European country is situation.
Not in the same way. I mean, Britain still has many land-owning gentry. They still have many great country houses that have been passed down from father to son. And they still have a pretty robust system of nobility with different ranks that actually hold sway in the political life and political outcomes in Britain.
Right. Wow. Okay. I was thinking of the big French homes. There's a word for them.
Chateau?
Chateaus, yeah.
Yeah. So they are in existence. The actual structures themselves are in existence. And I'm pretty sure there is some French nobility, but they simply don't have the same impact on the country's political fortunes as the British system.
Right. Well, yeah, nice. I mean, if you're a French person and you have a chateau, please get in touch to put us straight and invite me to your chateau as well. To prove, of course, that they have the chateau.
Yes.
Have you ever wondered if you're making real progress in your English learning journey? Knowing your level is the key to recognizing your improvements. I have a fantastic tool for you. A free English level test that gives you an instant result. Take a few minutes now to discover your level and continue your learning journey with confidence. Visit thebritishenglishpodcast.com/testme or click the link in the show notes to find out your level of English today.
Yeah, so we'll have a chat about that, sort of the origins of all of that, how the houses themselves worked. As you said before, they were actually the cultural center of an entire community. They were a small economy unto themselves, each house. And a central part of British life for several centuries.
And doing some research, I saw some facts about why the houses led to be too expensive to run. But before we go further with that, I noticed that it was partly because cities were becoming more popular. And does that mean that cities, like if I imagine back, was it more like everyone was spread out as a population? They were.
Yeah. So there was, this sort of change from country to city living was primarily to do with the Industrial Revolution, which occurred in the early 1700s. Now, the Industrial Revolution had a massive impact both on the explosion of these types of houses and then the decline of the houses. But we'll go into that a little bit later. Yeah. I think to begin with, how about we talk about where these houses originated from?
Perfect, yes. Were they born out of a genie granting somebody a wish from rubbing a lamp?
Well, some might say that. But unfortunately, for anybody listening to this podcast who wants to believe that, I'm a man who deals with facts and not fiction.
Good to get that straight.
Yes. Yes, Harry Potter is not real. Sorry, I'm so sorry to anyone out there who was learning English on the British English podcast in the hope of going to Hogwarts.
Yeah.
It's not a real place.
Yeah. He speaks the truth.
Although I might just be an ignorant muggle.
Yeah. I prefer that. Yeah.
And I like to think that J.K. Rowling is a squib. Do you know what a squib is?
Yeah.
So a squib is an insult for a person who was born into a magical family with no magical powers.
That actually works out very nicely because she was so upset that she wasn't a wizard or a witch. She just decided to rat on them and tell the world of muggles
completely
about them.
Yeah. I'm sitting here saying with full confidence that the wizarding world doesn't exist. And J.K. Rowling's probably a squib. I feel like that's a terrible insult. And I just want to call people I don't like a squib.
Don't look good, dude.
All right, let's get back. We've done
Harry Potter.
We've done Harry Potter. Let's get back to the Great English Country House. Let's talk about the origins.
Yeah. So when did this kind of come out of an era? What era are we talking?
Okay, so we're talking over 1,000 years. The systems that were in place in England basically brought this about. Now, the first thing to understand about the Great Country House is that they were estates that were owned by a class of people in Britain, a high class of people, the upper classes, called the land-owning gentry.
Okay.
Now, in essence, breaking it down into its simplest sense, the land-owning gentry were people who were granted pieces of land by the king, and they rented them out to farmers and tenants and received money for that rent.
Right.
And this land was passed down from father to son.
And how did the king or queen choose who would be?
Well, this all started and has its origins in feudal Europe.
Oh, good morning, Squire. I do hope you slept soundly. Care for some breakfast? Oh, yes, I'd love some. What's on the menu? Let's have a look, shall we? We have the buffet breakfast for premium podcast members, and we have the exclusive set menu if you're a member of the Academy. Oh, right, yeah. And apart from the breakfast options, why would I want to be a member of the premium podcast, you say? Or the Academy, sir? Yes. You see, premium members get to enjoy the buffet along with transcripts, glossaries and flashcards to use how and when you want. Rather like the buffet if you've not cottoned on yet, Mr. Smith. Right. Yeah. I get it. Very nice. All right. So just like the buffet, I can come and go as much as I like and eat or learn, in this case, in whatever way I like, with the basic stuff available for me. Precisely, Mr. Smith. Very good, very good. And then the members of the Academy get everything premium members get, but more importantly, they get to experience some fine dining with a set menu or structure of lessons with videos, audios, quizzes, assignments, speaking classes on Zoom, the speaking partner program, and entry into a lottery to win one-to-one classes with Charlie, the host of the podcast this bed and breakfast is associated with.
Gosh, it's a fair amount of stuff, isn't it? You don't suppose I could sample a bit of both options before I decide what to do?
It's funny you should say that, because we indeed have a sample sausage from the buffet, along with a sample of the premium podcast over at thebritishenglishpodcast.com/premium. And of course, we have some caviar and a full lesson to sample for the Academy over on thebritishenglishpodcast.com/academy. Again, all the links will be in the show notes and on that menu in front of you, sir. I will leave it with you to think over, and I do hope you enjoy yourself.
Right, yeah, thanks. Food for thought, I suppose.
Now, feudal Europe is a system that was around hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So,
Not thousands?
no. I mean, we may have had the earliest origins of it then, but I mean, without going into areas of debate, let's just put it around the last 1,000 years.
Okay.
We could say we had the start of a feudal system. You know, perhaps before that, but especially in England.
Okay.
Now, what that was basically an agreement between the king and nobles who he granted land. He bequeathed them huge swathes of land in return for services to the crown, such as military service and management of that area, keeping it under control.
Right. So if you went to battle and you did well, maybe he would reward you with a bit of land.
Yeah, or you were wealthy enough that you could afford armor and a horse and a sword, and he saw you as a person who could be very helpful in a battle. He would bequeath him a large swathe of land in order for the return of military service.
Right. Okay.
That's putting it in a very simplistic way, but in essence, they had a deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they would help defend the kingdom and those areas for the king in return for this land. And under this system, this feudal system, there were basically the local lords or nobility.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had the local peasants. The peasants had their own separate system with the local lord, where the lord would give them or rent them land and protection in return for military service to that lord.
Okay.
Yeah. In essence, it was a convoluted system in order to raise an army.
Right. Okay. Trying to think of the big picture of, again, where they would all live. I think I read something about it being like they're in small towns that are within castle walls.
Yeah, so medieval Europe and medieval England weren't the stable countries that they are today. 1,000 years ago, we had places like, just off the top of my head, it was like East Anglia was its own small kingdom,
Okay.
for example. And all of these different little kingdoms had their own kings. And these kings, even within Britain, they would fight each other. And today, obviously, we have a very stabilized, very well set out boundaries in Europe. Well, not always so, as we can see with Russia and Ukraine right now. But in essence, England wasn't as stable as it is now. So
Internally.
internally, yeah. And so they had to have these devices and these systems in order to protect their kingdoms. Now, one of the other things with this feudal system was that they used to have everyone living within castles. Now, everyone knows what a castle is, and these medieval castles were basically huge structures which housed basically the entire locality, the entire town. It had the king's court and rooms of governance. It had the food stores. It had the military barracks. It had everything that you could expect to find within a small town. A lot of the peasants would live in the farmlands and toil the crops outside the castle, but the castle was a huge structure that basically encompassed a lot of that local community.
Yeah. I guess when I was younger, I did go through that at school, like learning that, but I've completely forgotten about that. And when I go to see castles, I don't really think about the whole of the population trying to fit within that fortress.
Yeah, I mean, this was a thing all throughout Europe. I mean, one of the most famous castles that you can go in and see these days is in Salzburg in Germany. This wasn't unique to Britain at all.
Is that the one that's in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang?
I have absolutely no idea. I've never seen Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Have you not?
No, is it good?
It's one of those films that was on all the time as a kid, before Netflix, I suppose. Neuschwanstein Castle.
Okay, that is, I think, that really famous Disney-style castle.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and you'll notice these castles are often, like Salzburg and that one, are both on high cliff escarpments. They would find certain areas of high rock and they would build the walls around there to defend themselves. This is in the period where they had bow and arrow. They didn't have guns and things like that. So,
nuclear bombs.
Yeah, so they basically put themselves inside an all-purpose fortress. Then, as European society stabilized under single rulers, the need for these castles lessened and lessened and lessened. And
so these kingdoms now kind of relax, and it's now a whole country where there's one king?
Yes, so all the
or
kings...
queen.
Basically, all the kings fought each other and one swallowed up the other and swallowed up the other. And eventually...
Literally?
Oh, yeah. These kings used to be 50 feet tall and...
Oh, my God. Well,
they would eat entire towns.
Since we're talking about eating kings, I found a fact that I have no idea.
I am excited for this fact. What the hell?
So King Henry VIII, when he died, he was a very large man. He was apparently 400 pounds.
And he was about 6'3" or something?
Okay. I mean, that's not too short, but you mean as in like a big...
I believe he was a tall guy.
Yeah, okay. But still, that's overweight for a 6'3".
Oh, he's very...
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so he was buried, or he was put in his coffin, and I don't know if you know this gross fact, but when bodies die, they kind of enlarge, like
they bloat.
They bloat.
Yeah.
And he bloated so much that he burst, and the liquids came out of the coffin, and his dogs licked them up.
Oh, God. Do you ever think that if your cat, like a dog, right, is super loyal to you and would protect you, but a cat, if they were the same size as us, they would just kill us?
Oh, yeah. They would.
I mean, no matter how much you have loved them.
Like lions and shit.
Yeah, I know, but this is even a domestic cat. If you know, when you're walking along, I don't know if it was just a peculiarity of my cat, but I would walk along and it would jump. It would there was an instinct in it, and it would look at my foot like an antelope, and it would sprint at high speed and just jump on it and wrap its claws all around my feet and bite into my big toe.
Yeah, and then it would get into that kind of spooning position, and then it would kind of kick like a rabbit with its back feet.
Yeah.
That would be painful.
Yeah, honestly, if they were the same size as us, they would just eat us. They would, yeah.
Well, that's why we don't live in the savannah.
Yeah. I'm surprised as humans walking around in the savannah we ever managed to survive.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly.
I mean, I wouldn't survive, but back then they might have.
They must have had a lot more about them.
Yeah. But yeah, that's my fun fact about a dead king.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Okay. So we were up to the need for castles as a single entity. Now, as the fears of sort of endemic warfare died away, which is basically internal warfare, and the state stabilized and became ruled under a single ruler, the need for these castles disappeared. We may have needed warships and fortresses on the border to repel the invading French, for example, but not endemic internal warfare anymore. So the need for these big castles disappeared, and they split into 3 different entities. You had the fortress, which was the castle.
Right.
But now it was just purely a utilitarian fortress for defense.
Okay.
And they changed in shape as well because the weaponry changed. They were much lower to the ground. They didn't have these high vaulted walls. The second part of this was the palace. Now, the castles used to be the residence of the king, but now the king didn't need to live in the fortress. They lived in a separate building, which was what we now call a palace. So the Palace of Versailles, for example, these huge, opulent buildings that were more for show and a comfortable lifestyle.
So did a castle turn into a fortress and a palace as 2 separate things, or were they like, that prettier part of the castle is going to be the palace?
No, it did separate literally into two different.
So they rebuilt.
Yes, they would eventually. I mean, there's plenty of castles still around today. I suppose they may have just either abandoned them or used just the castle as the fortress and then gone on to build big palaces as well.
Yeah. And this is where all the princes and princesses
exactly.
lived.
These buildings were not about defense. They were about opulence. They were about showing everyone their divine right to rule, their power, and living the most amazing life of comfort that they could possibly ever envisage.
Still no toilet paper, though.
No, that's right. But they had servants who could do all that sort of stuff, I suppose. I was once listening to a podcast by Carl Pilkington and Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant where Carl told a story about a crazy English major who apparently said to Carl's brother in the war that, you know, if you have limited toilet paper supplies, what you do is you put your finger through the toilet, a hole in the toilet paper, scrape it all out, and then pull it out and wipe it off with the toilet paper and walk away. And
walk away?
That's just the most mental thing I've ever heard in my life.
But walk away from the toilet, like proud?
Just throw it away and walk away. Job done. Yeah, exactly. It sounds like some sort of crazy deluded English major from the early 20th century would say.
You're making me think of my friend from uni who admitted that he often picks his nose by taking a piece of tissue and putting a hole through it and then pretends that he's blowing his nose with tissue, but he's just picking his nose with his finger.
Oh, that's mental. That's not hiding. That's... I mean, what is that? That's like, back to cats. That's like when a cat thinks they're hiding and you can just see their tail flicking from behind the couch. I mean, that's mental.
Yeah.
All right. So there was a third entity that came out of this splitting up division of the traditional castle. So we've got the fortress, we've got the palace, and then we have the manor house. Now, the manor house was the equivalent of a palace, but for the nobility. So they were never as big as the palaces for the kings and queens, but they served the same function. They showed off. They displayed to the rest of the population their power, their wealth, and it was about comfortable country living.
Getting a servant to wipe your bum.
Exactly. I mean, isn't that the dream, Charlie? I mean, that's why you started this business, isn't it?
It is. I think I'm 2 years away from being able to do that.
Why did I see a dirty man scampering away when I came in here today holding a fistful of toilet paper?
That was the postman.
You've got him doing two jobs.
I've delivered some poo to somebody.
Yeah, they call him the postman. No, they call you the postman.
I don't like where this is going, Ben.
Okay.
So
basically we had the introduction of the manor house. Now, the reason these houses were able to exist in such vast numbers was because these noble classes had existed for so long. They still owned these huge swathes of land. They had been passed down from generation to generation to generation over hundreds of years in the last millennium. And now as Britain became stronger and stronger and at the height of its powers, when trade was at its greatest, these noble classes were making just unfathomable amounts of money. And so what did they do with it? They built more and more bigger and better, more opulent houses.
Wow. It makes so much sense to think why people wanted to escape to America and start over and have, like, you know, merit or meritocracy be the fundamental of their success as a community.
Oh, yeah. I mean, England, if you were born into the lower classes, you really were always going to be in the lower classes. If you were born into the aristocracy, there were some laws in place and strong traditions that meant you weren't going to leave that position either. I mean, a lot of the aristocracy didn't actually have options in what they wanted to do.
A bit like today, where we see the royals aren't necessarily happy being who they are.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So part of this system was that it was bound by the British law. There was a thing called an entail. Now, that entail basically was a law that said that these properties had to be passed from father to son, or from, the owner to the nearest male relative.
Ah, okay. Like the eldest son, yeah.
Yeah. Now, this entail actually meant that it was against the law to sell these houses. So not only were these families entitled to all of this land, but they were also by law unable to relieve themselves of this responsibility. Now, one of the things about this landowning class is, especially in this period, is they did have legions of servants and they did have these big houses, but they also had a responsibility. They were basically the head of a localized economy.
Yeah.
So they rent out land to all the local tenants. So that's farmers, bakery workers, anyone who owned a business, anybody on that land that landed gentry owned, they paid taxes. But the landed gentry had to look after this area. They had to look after the property, which was a huge, monumental task in itself. And then they had to deal with all of the local tenants as well. I mean, this is a job that the eldest son could not get out of.
Wow.
This is, it's the law.
It's hard to feel sorry for them comparatively to the people that are working for them, because they're like doing, 18-hour shifts.
Absolutely.
Ridiculously poor, low wages. But still, that's hard to swallow, the idea that you're forced into this huge responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, they were bound to this whether they wanted to do it or not. And they couldn't sell the property. Although they probably had amazing lives, I'm sure a lot of that life would have been very stifling.
Yeah.
They didn't have freedoms that other people had. Now, comparatively as well to the new wealth that came out of the Industrial Revolution, the people who were actually in these positions of ownership through law, their position was nowhere near as good as the new wealthy, the novo rich, as they called them, these huge industrialists who started buying country properties, because those industrialists could buy and sell and they didn't owe anyone anything.
So they weren't stuck. They were free to play the market.
Yeah, and there were a lot of them. So through the 1700s and early 1800s, that was the peak of the British country house.
1700s and 1800s.
And the early 1800s. This is this was the peak. This is when the British Empire was at its peak monetarily. And it's when the Industrial Revolution had begun to make many, many, many wealthy middle-class people.
Right.
And, they were sometimes, these middle-class people were sometimes wealthier than the aristocracy.
Sorry, the middle-class people are coming from these great English houses, or are you saying that these are people
they would buy up these great English properties because they could? It was the equivalent of billionaires today buying up, super yachts.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So the middle class are starting to overtake the aristocracy.
Yeah,
in wealth.
Yes, exactly.
And power, I guess.
Yeah, but basically, if we may have jumped the gun a tiny bit there, but before we get to that, because we will talk about the Industrial Revolution and how it had an effect on these houses in both their development and their eventual end, let's just quickly go through something that I think is quite interesting for everyone, which are the ranks of nobility in England.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's do that.
If you've seen Downton Abbey, you will have seen that the Earl of Grantham is the owner of that estate.
Okay. And
you'll see all the responsibilities that he has. Then if you look at something like Pride and the Prejudice, which is set at the end of the 1700s, very early 1800s at latest, and there is debate there, you would see someone like Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. Mr. Darcy owns a huge estate, and that's the exact same system. He is not in the nobility, in the noble classes, but he is a lord.
I know this is really obvious to many people, but it makes me realize why marrying into the right family is so important, because it's not like you can make your way up through your own entrepreneurship. You literally have no choice to, change your status in life unless you marry, right?
Do you mean if you're part of the aristocracy?
No, like if you're slightly under that.
Yeah, so that's true until the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and then we did see big changes. But still, that was a slow process, and then there were only a few very wealthy people from that.
Yeah.
But there was a rising middle class, that's for sure.
But I'm thinking, like, in those series like Bridgerton and Downton Abbey, marrying the right person was so important for the females.
Oh, yeah. There were not just to do with laws and entails and things like that, but to do with your social status. Social status, we don't experience that in the same way today. I mean, we do have wealthy people and poorer people, but we don't have that same extreme level of class system and respect for it that existed then. So it's difficult to transplant ourselves back then. But yes, who you married and your status in society based on that was incredibly impactful on your life.
Yeah. And they didn't have the idea of, making your own money to then have that respect for having made your own money in your own life, I guess, did they? So they didn't have that comparison. They just had like royalty, aristocracy,
yes,
and then people underneath.
Primarily, yes, until I would say the end of the 1900s, early 20th century. End of the 1800s, early 20th century. That's when that really started to change, especially after World War One.
Yeah, I can imagine that is a huge area that we need to go into, but we're unfortunately out of time for part one. So listeners, if you wanted to join us for the conversation all about World War One and how that changed everything that we're talking about, and
I was going to use that as a bit of a lead-in to talk about the British noble ranks. I'm going to go through what the 5 major British noble ranks are and the origins.
Nice, yeah. So if you guys want to join for that, then check out the Premium Podcast or the Academy membership. And those that are already active members, then we will see you in part 2. But for those part 1 listeners, thank you very much, Ben, for taking the time to research that. And thank you again.
Absolutely. Not a problem.
Cool. All right. See you in part 2.
See you in part 2.
We will leave it there for part 1 of today's episode. Thank you very much for listening up to this point. If you did want to listen to part 2 and part 3 of this conversation, then you can head over to thebritishenglishpodcast.com and check out the Premium Podcast or Academy memberships. The Premium Podcast gives you access to the full conversation along with extended glossaries, transcripts, and flashcards, whereas the Academy gives you all of that plus exclusive videos and audios for the season-based episodes, explaining the vocabulary, exampling them, giving you quizzes, writing assignments, and weekly speaking classes on Zoom. But if you were just here for part 1 of this conversation, then I thank you very much for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed the show. Do grab that free worksheet by clicking the link in the show notes. My name's Charlie, and I will see you next week on the British English Podcast. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Before you go, make sure you know where you stand in your English learning journey. I've created a free English level test that you can take right now to find out your exact level. It's quick, easy, and gives you instant results. Head to thebritishenglishpodcast.com/testme or check the link in the show notes. Because tracking your progress helps you stay on track. We can't use track twice, guys. No, let's do that again. Yep, we don't have time. Oh. All right, we'll just delete this last sentence then.